September 1945. Camp Hood, Texas. The afternoon sun beat down on the sprawling compound where rows of white barracks stretched across the flat landscape, and inside one of those buildings, a group of Japanese soldiers sat in stunned silence, their eyes fixed on the meal before them. Roasted chicken, fresh vegetables, bread with butter and milk. For men who had spent months preparing for honorable death rather than surrender, who had been taught that capture meant unspeakable torture and degradation. This moment made absolutely no sense. They believed they knew what awaited prisoners in enemy hands. They were about to discover how catastrophically wrong they had been. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What these men would experience over the coming months would not just challenge everything they had been told about their enemies, but would fundamentally transform their understanding of honor, humanity, and the very war they had fought. This is the story of how a Texas prison camp became the most confusing battlefield some Japanese soldiers ever encountered. Corporal Takeshi Yamamoto had survived the brutal island campaigns in the Pacific, watching friends disappear into the jungle or fall during desperate charges. When American forces finally overwhelmed his position on Okinawa in June of 1945, he had clutched a grenade, ready to fulfill his final duty. But exhaustion, hunger, and the relentless American advance had left him too weak to pull the pin. An American medic had found him unconscious in a shell crater, dehydrated and delirious with fever from an infected wound. Instead of the execution he expected upon waking, he received medical treatment. That was his first shock. Now, sitting in this strange place called Texas, thousands of kilometers from home, he struggled to reconcile his current reality with everything he had been taught. The propaganda had been clear and constant throughout his military service. American soldiers were barbarians who showed no mercy, who tortured prisoners for entertainment, who respected no code of honor. Every Japanese soldier knew that capture meant a fate worse than death. It was why so many had chosen to fight until the end, why surrender had been virtually unthinkable. The military education system had reinforced these beliefs through every channel available. Newsreels, pamphlets, speeches from commanding officers, and the unofficial but pervasive culture of shame surrounding the very concept of survival through surrender. Yamamoto remembered the words of his commanding officer before the final American assault on their position. "Death is lighter than a feather, but duty is heavier than a mountain," the officer had said, his face gaunt from weeks of short rations. "The Americans will defile everything you hold sacred. Better to meet your ancestors with honor than to live in shame." The officer had then turned his pistol on himself rather than face capture. Yamamoto had been too weak from dysentery to follow his example. But here he sat, very much alive, eating food that was better than anything he had tasted in the last 2 years of the war. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. The chicken alone represented more protein than he had consumed in a typical month during the final stages of the island campaign. The fresh vegetables were a luxury he had almost forgotten existed. And the milk. Milk was something he had not seen since leaving Japan years before. Private First Class Hiroshi Tanaka, sitting across from Yamamoto, picked at his meal with visible suspicion. At 23 years old, he had been drafted from his family's farm near Nagoya and had spent 18 months fighting across the Pacific. His worldview had been shaped by military indoctrination that began in childhood. Lessons about Japanese superiority, about the weakness and cruelty of Western powers, about the sacred duty to the emperor. In elementary school, he had learned that Japan had never lost a war in its entire history, that the divine wind would always protect the homeland, that Japanese spirit would always overcome material disadvantage. "They are fattening us for some purpose," Tanaka whispered in Japanese, careful to keep his voice low even though most of the American guards could not understand him. "This cannot be what it appears. Perhaps they need us for labor. Perhaps they plan to parade us as examples. There must be a reason for this deception." Sergeant Kenji Nakamura, older at 31 and a veteran of campaigns in China before the Pacific War, shook his head slowly. He had seen more than the younger men, had begun to notice inconsistencies between what they had been told and what he had observed even before his capture. "I have been watching the guards," he said quietly. "They show no signs of the cruelty we were promised. They are almost indifferent. Professional, but not cruel. When Private Sato collapsed from fever yesterday, they carried him to the medical clinic immediately. I watched through the window. They treated him the same way they would treat one of their own. The camp itself defied every expectation. Camp Hood, located near Killeen in central Texas, had been established in 1942 primarily as a training facility for American tank destroyer battalions. But by 1944, portions of the vast installation, which covered over 210,000 acres, were being converted to house prisoners of war. First came German prisoners, captured in North Africa and Europe, then Italians, after Italy's surrender in 1943, and by 1945, Japanese prisoners began arriving from the Pacific Theater, though in much smaller numbers than their European counterparts, due to the Japanese military's emphasis on fighting to the end rather than surrendering. The barracks were simple but sturdy wooden structures, each housing 30 to 40 men. They had running water, and luxury that seemed almost decadent to men who had spent months drinking from streams and rainwater collections. They had electricity, with lights that worked at the flip of a switch. They had heating for the cold Texas winters, which, while mild by northern standards, were still a shock to men from tropical combat zones. The beds were individual cots with mattresses and blankets, not the hammocks or bare ground they had grown accustomed to, but actual beds with springs and padding. There were latrines with plumbing, a concept that seemed almost futuristic after months of crude latrine trenches. Shower facilities provided hot water at scheduled times throughout the week. There was even a small medical clinic staffed by both American doctors and prisoner doctors who had been identified among the captured men and were allowed to practice under supervision. For men who had spent months living in muddy foxholes, surviving on handfuls of rice when rations came at all, watching dysentery and malaria decimate their ranks with no medicine available to treat them, the basic amenities of Camp Hood seemed impossibly luxurious. It was not comfort by peacetime civilian standards. The barracks were stark, the schedules rigid, the freedom non-existent. But compared to the conditions they had endured during the final year of the war, it was almost incomprehensible. Captain Robert Morrison, the American officer in charge of the Japanese prisoner section, had served in the Pacific Theater himself and had seen the fanatical resistance Japanese forces offered at places like Iwo Jima and Okinawa. He had expected the prisoners to be difficult, hostile, perhaps even dangerous. What he found instead were men in a state of profound psychological shock, unable to process their current circumstances through the lens of everything they had been taught. "They won't eat at first," Morrison told his staff during a briefing in late September. "They think we have poisoned the food. Some of them are waiting to be executed and seem almost confused that we are delaying. They simply cannot process that we are treating them according to the Geneva Conventions." I have had multiple prisoners ask, through translators, when the torture will begin. They seem genuinely baffled when we tell them there will be no torture. Lieutenant James Chen, a Nisei officer from California, whose Japanese language skills and cultural understanding made him invaluable, understood the cultural dimensions of the prisoners' confusion better than most. "In their military culture, sir, surrender is the ultimate dishonor," he explained to Morrison and the other officers. "They have been taught since childhood that death in service to the emperor is the highest honor a man can achieve. By surrendering, or in many cases by simply surviving when they should have fought to the end, they believe they have already lost everything. Their honor, their family's honor, their very right to exist. They cannot comprehend why we would treat disgraced men with any decency. In their framework, a man without honor is not worthy of basic human consideration." The psychological warfare that had shaped Japanese military thinking went far beyond simple propaganda. It was a comprehensive system that began in elementary school and intensified through military training. Students were taught that Japan had never lost a war in its entire history, that the emperor was divine and descended from the sun goddess, that Japanese culture and people were inherently superior to all others. Western nations were portrayed as decadent, cruel, and fundamentally hostile to Asian peoples. The Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, as Japanese expansion was officially termed, was presented as a benevolent mission to free Asia from Western colonialism, with Japan as the natural leader of Asian peoples. This indoctrination was reinforced through every aspect of military life. Brutality from superior officers was normalized as necessary discipline that built fighting spirit. Surrender was not presented merely as undesirable, but as literally unthinkable. A betrayal not just of one's comrades but of one's ancestors, one's family, and the nation itself. Stories were circulated of Chinese prisoners being tortured by Western forces, of British cruelty to Asian subjects, of American racism against Asian peoples. These stories, some based on historical incidents and many simply invented, created a narrative in which Japanese soldiers were engaged in a righteous struggle against forces of pure evil. The treatment of Allied prisoners by Japanese forces had reflected these attitudes. Without a cultural framework that honored captured enemies, and with active propaganda depicting Americans, British, and Australians as subhuman, many Japanese soldiers had seen no reason to treat prisoners with any consideration. The result had been camps where mortality rates exceeded 50%, where systematic abuse was routine, where the basic provisions mandated by international law were simply ignored. This was not universal. Individual Japanese soldiers and even some commanders had shown mercy and humanity, but the overall pattern was one of systematic disregard for prisoner welfare. Now, men shaped by this system found themselves on the receiving end of the very laws their own military had dismissed as Western weakness. Yamamoto watched carefully as American guards distributed additional blankets as October brought cooler weather to central Texas. He observed them organizing recreational activities, baseball games where prisoners could play against each other, craft workshops where men could make small items to occupy their hands and minds, even educational classes where those who were interested could learn English or study American history and culture. He saw medical personnel treating sick prisoners with the same attention they gave American soldiers in the base hospital, using the same medicine and giving the same care. Each observation created a small crack in the edifice of his previous understanding. Each kindness, each moment of decent treatment, each interaction that failed to match his expectations eroded his certainty about what he had been taught. The breaking point came for many prisoners with the Red Cross packages. In November of 1945, several months after the war had officially ended with Japan's surrender in August, prisoners at Camp Hood began receiving packages from the International Red Cross, packages that contained cigarettes, chocolate, coffee, canned goods, soap, and personal items like playing cards and writing paper. Tanaka stared at his package as though it might explode. His hands trembled as he touched the items inside. Pulling out a bar of chocolate, he turned over and over, examining it from every angle. "Why?" he asked Nakamura, his voice confused and almost angry. "The war is over. We are defeated enemies. Japan has surrendered unconditionally. We have no value as hostages or bargaining chips. Why do they give us these things? What purpose does it serve?" Nakamura had been doing a great deal of thinking over the past weeks. He had started attending the English classes offered by the camp, had begun conversations with Lieutenant Chen about American culture and history, had read materials about the Geneva Conventions that govern treatment of prisoners, documents that explained that decent treatment was not a favor but an obligation, not a strategy but a principle. "I think," he said slowly, choosing his words carefully, "that we have been lied to about more than just this, about more than just how they would treat us. I think perhaps we have been lied to about many things." This realization, spreading gradually through the prisoner population, was devastating in its implications. If they had been lied to about American treatment of prisoners, something they could now verify with their own eyes, what else had been false? The claims of inevitable Japanese victory that had been made even as American forces closed in on the home islands. The stories of American atrocities in occupied territories, the entire framework of Japanese superiority that had justified the war itself. The camp administration, aware of the psychological crisis many prisoners were experiencing, brought in counselors and facilitated discussions. They showed newsreels of the war's end, of the signing of surrender documents aboard the battleship Missouri in Tokyo Bay, of the occupation of Japan, of Japanese civilians going about their lives under American administration without the mass executions, enslavement, or systematic torture that propaganda had predicted would follow defeat. Yamamoto watched footage of Tokyo, seeing streets he recognized and buildings that still stood despite months of firebombing. He saw American soldiers distributing food to hungry Japanese civilians, including children. He saw schools reopening with new textbooks. He saw life continuing in a defeated nation that was supposed to have been utterly destroyed. The cognitive dissonance was almost physically painful, creating a pressure in his chest and a confusion in his mind that no amount of contemplation seemed able to resolve. "My family," he said to Lieutenant Chen during one of their conversations. The young officer had become a trusted intermediary, someone who understood both cultures and could help bridge the vast psychological gulf between what prisoners had been taught and what they were experiencing. What will they think? They received notification that I was missing and presumed lost in battle. Now I am alive but dishonored by survival. How can I face them? How can I return to a village where everyone will know I surrendered instead of dying honorably? Chen's response was careful but firm. "The war is over, Corporal. The old rules, the old propaganda, they served a purpose for those who wanted to continue fighting even when the cause was hopeless, but they were not truth. They were tools used to maintain fighting spirit and prevent surrender even in the face of certain defeat. Your family is alive, thanks to the war ending when it did. Would you rather they had perished in an invasion of the home islands? Would you rather you had died on some beach for a cause that was already lost, leaving them to wonder if their sacrifice had any meaning?" These conversations, repeated in various forms across the camp, between prisoners and translators, between older prisoners and younger ones, between men struggling to understand and those who had begun to accept, began to chip away at years of indoctrination. But the process was neither quick nor easy. It was painful, disorienting, and for some men, simply impossible. Some prisoners, unable to reconcile their treatment with their previous worldview, retreated into denial or conspiracy theories. They insisted that the comfort of the camp was temporary, that punishment would come later. They claimed that the war was not really over, that Japan would rise again. They interpreted every kindness as a manipulation, every decent act as part of some elaborate plan. A few continued to express loyalty to the old military ideology, though even they could not help but notice the gap between what they had been promised and what they were experiencing. But others, like Nakamura, Yamamoto, and eventually Tanaka, began a painful process of reassessment that would change them fundamentally. The camp offered work programs, and many prisoners volunteered, not just for the small payment they received in camp scrip that could be used at the canteen, but for something to do, for a sense of purpose in days that otherwise stretched endlessly. Some worked in the camp gardens, producing vegetables that supplemented both prisoner and staff meals. Others assisted with maintenance, keeping the camp facilities in working order. A few with specialized skills helped with translation or taught in educational programs. Yamamoto found himself assigned to the camp library, helping to organize books and materials. It was work that suited his temperament and gave him access to reading material that began to transform his understanding. He began, tentatively at first, to read American newspapers and magazines that Lieutenant Chen provided, with help translating difficult passages. He learned about American history, about a nation built by immigrants from many lands, about political debates that happened openly, about citizens who questioned their government's decisions without fear of imprisonment. The idea of public criticism of government policy was almost incomprehensible to someone raised in a system where such discussion could mean a visit from the military police. Yet here were American newspapers freely debating everything from military strategy to economic policy to social issues. Some newspapers supported the government's decisions, others criticized them sharply, all published without apparent censorship or consequence. "They argue with their own leaders," Yamamoto said to Nakamura one evening, showing him a newspaper article criticizing certain aspects of American policy in the Pacific occupation. "And they are not arrested, they are not even silenced. The newspaper continues to publish. How is this possible? How does a nation function when citizens openly question authority?" This revelation, that the American system not only tolerated but expected such debate, that it viewed free discussion as a strength rather than a weakness, was perhaps more transformative than anything else. It suggested a completely different understanding of governance, of the relationship between people and state, of what strength and unity actually meant. As autumn turned to winter, and then to spring of 1946, the psychological transformation of many prisoners deepened. The camp administration began showing films, not just newsreels about the war and occupation, but entertainment films that showed American life and culture. Prisoners watched movies with subtitles, seeing portrayals of American society that bore no resemblance to the propaganda images of a decadent, divided nation teetering on the edge of chaos. They saw stories of ordinary people facing everyday challenges, of communities coming together to solve problems, of individual dignity and freedom of choice. They saw humor and humanity in a culture they had been taught to view as inferior and corrupt. They saw families not so different from their own, workers not so different from themselves, concerns and hopes and dreams that transcended national boundaries. Tanaka, watching a film about an American farm family struggling through difficult times, felt tears on his cheeks and did not bother to wipe them away. "It is just like my family," he said quietly to the men sitting near him in the makeshift theater. "The concerns about the harvest, the hopes for children's futures, the love between family members. They are the same. How can this be if we are so superior and they are so different?" This recognition of common humanity, cutting through layers of propaganda and cultural indoctrination, was perhaps the most powerful transformation of all. It was one thing to intellectually acknowledge that propaganda might have exaggerated differences. It was another to feel in one's heart the fundamental sameness of human experience across cultures and nations. In May of 1946, preparations began for the repatriation of Japanese prisoners. Ships would take them back across the Pacific to a homeland most had not seen for years, to a nation defeated and occupied, but also beginning the long process of recovery and rebuilding under American supervision. The process would take months, with prisoners being sent in groups as transportation became available. The night before the first group was scheduled to depart, Yamamoto sat down to write a letter he had been composing in his mind for months. It was addressed to his family, and with Lieutenant Chen's help, he arranged for it to be sent ahead of his arrival so they would have time to prepare for his return. In it, he tried to explain the incomprehensible. He wrote about the treatment he had received, about the kindness of guards he had expected to be cruel, about the abundance in a nation that propaganda had portrayed as weak and impoverished. He wrote about watching films and reading newspapers, and learning about a society so different from anything he had been taught to expect. He wrote about Americans who had shown him more honor as a defeated enemy than his own command had shown him as a loyal soldier. Most importantly, he wrote about what he had learned about truth and lies, about how authority could deceive, even with what it claimed were the best intentions, about the importance of questioning and thinking for oneself rather than simply accepting what those in power proclaimed. "I believed I knew what honor meant," he wrote in careful characters. "I believed surrender was the ultimate dishonor, that our enemies were monsters without humanity, that our cause was unquestionably just and our victory inevitable. I have learned that I was wrong about all of these things. True honor, I now think, is in seeing truth clearly, even when it is uncomfortable or challenges what we have been taught. True strength is in admitting when one has been deceived rather than clinging to comfortable lies. I do not know what awaits me in our defeated homeland, but I hope to carry this lesson forward and to share it with others when appropriate." Not all prisoners underwent such profound transformations. The human mind is complex, and years of indoctrination cannot be undone in months, especially when that undoing requires admitting that beliefs one held sacred were false. Some remained bitter, convinced that their decent treatment was an elaborate trick or a sign of American weakness rather than strength. Others accepted the material benefits of the camp while internally maintaining their previous beliefs, compartmentalizing their experience as an exception rather than a revelation. Still others were simply too damaged by war, too traumatized by their experiences, to engage in the kind of reflection that transformation required. But for many, perhaps most, the experience of captivity in Texas camps like Hood had shattered their previous understanding of the world in ways that could never fully be repaired or reversed. They had come face to face with evidence that contradicted everything they had been taught, and they could not unsee what they had seen or unknown what they had learned. When the ships carrying repatriated prisoners arrived in Japanese ports in the summer and fall of 1946, the returnees found a nation transformed by defeat and occupation. The military government that had shaped their worldview was gone, dismantled by American occupation authorities. The emperor had renounced his divinity in a radio address that shocked the nation. American occupation forces were overseeing the creation of a new constitution, a new political system, a new Japan built on democratic principles rather than military conquest. In this context of comprehensive transformation, the experiences of returned prisoners took on new meaning. Their stories of decent treatment, of abundance in America, of discovering that propaganda had lied about fundamental realities, helped shape how many Japanese civilians understood what had happened and what came next. They provided a counter-narrative to those who might have nursed resentment or dreams of renewed militarism. Yamamoto returned to his village to find his family alive, but struggling in the post-war economy. Food was scarce, work was uncertain, and the entire social order had been upended by defeat and occupation. His mother wept when she saw him, not with shame as he had feared, but with relief and joy at seeing her son alive. His father, a veteran of an earlier war against Russia, listened to his son's stories of captivity and nodded slowly with understanding. "We were told many things that were not true," the older man said after a long silence. "In my war, too, there was propaganda. But in my time, we won, so the lies were never revealed. Perhaps it is good that you survived to learn these truths. Perhaps this knowledge is what will make the future different from the past." In the years that followed, as Japan rebuilt with American assistance through the Marshall Plan and other programs, as former enemies became allies against new threats in the Cold War, as Japanese democracy took root and flourished in ways few would have predicted in 1945, the experiences of men like Yamamoto contributed to a broader reckoning with the militaristic past. Some former prisoners became educators, teaching younger generations about the costs of propaganda and the importance of critical thinking, of questioning authority, of seeking truth even when it contradicts what one wants to believe. Others simply returned to private life, carrying their transformative experiences quietly, but letting them shape how they raised their children and engaged with their communities. They taught their sons and daughters to think for themselves, to question narratives that seemed too simple, to recognize common humanity across national boundaries. Nakamura, using skills he had developed in the camp and building on his language abilities, eventually became a translator and worked on cultural exchange programs between Japan and America. He often reflected on the irony that his imprisonment, what he had thought would be the end of his life, had given him opportunities and understanding he would never have gained otherwise. He helped bridge the gap between two nations that had been bitter enemies, facilitating understanding between people who had once sought to destroy each other. Tanaka returned to his family farm and threw himself into the work of rebuilding, of coaxing crops from soil that had been neglected during the war years. But on quiet evenings he would sometimes tell his children about Texas, about a prison camp that showed him the world was larger and more complex than he had ever imagined, about enemies who treated him with more humanity than he had been led to expect. These stories shaped how his children understood their nation's history and its place in the world. The story of Japanese prisoners in American camps during and after World War II remains less well known than many other aspects of the conflict. It does not fit easily into simple narratives of good versus evil, of Allied virtue versus Axis cruelty. The reality was more complex and sometimes contradictory. American treatment of Japanese prisoners was generally good and consistent with international law, even as Japanese Americans faced internment in their own country, a shameful contradiction in a nation fighting for freedom and democracy. But for the men who experienced it, the decent treatment they received when they expected torture, the abundance they witnessed when they had been told of American weakness and impending collapse, the humanity they discovered when they had been taught to see monsters, these experiences had profound and lasting impacts that rippled through generations. They learned that propaganda could lie with absolute confidence and systematic thoroughness. They learned that authority could be wrong, even when speaking with complete certainty. They learned that enemies could be honorable even in victory. They learned that the world was far more complicated than the simple stories told by those who wanted to maintain power and continue fighting. These lessons, learned in the most unlikely of classrooms, a prison camp in Texas, thousands of kilometers from home, in a nation they had been taught to hate, helped shape the post-war consciousness of a generation. They contributed, in small but significant ways, to Japan's transformation from militaristic empire to peaceful democracy, from America's bitter enemy to one of its closest allies. The barracks of Camp Hood are long gone now, replaced by the sprawling Fort Hood military installation that continues to serve as one of America's largest military bases. But the memory of what happened there remains in letters and memoirs, in oral histories and family stories, a reminder that even in war, even between the most bitter of enemies, human decency and international law can prevail over hatred and propaganda. For Yamamoto and thousands like him, a Texas prison camp became the place where they lost their illusions and gained something more valuable, a more honest understanding of the world and their place in it. They had expected hell and found humanity. They had prepared for death and discovered life, and in that discovery, painful and disorienting as it was, they found not shame but the beginning of wisdom, and that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.